In the Pacific Ocean, June 1944, a blue territory so immense it appears boundless, yet upon this glistening arena the concluding sequence of a violent global conflict is preparing to commence. For the Japanese Empire, the momentum has shifted. The rapid triumphs of 1941 have become fading recollections, supplanted by a harsh existence of attrition and withdrawal. One island after another has been seized by the unyielding American industrial powerhouse, a massive force that advances steadily toward the mainland. However, within the core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership, a singular potent doctrine remains as fervent as a faith, Ekantai Kessen, the decisive battle. This was a philosophy embedded into the very essence of their naval strategy, a conviction that one solitary, overwhelming fleet engagement could crush the adversary, destroy their spirit to fight, and clinch victory in one magnificent afternoon. This was more than a tactic, it was an infatuation. For decades, every vessel constructed, every officer coached, and every simulation conducted was done to achieve this final showdown. They imagined a Mahanian duel of dreadnoughts and carriers that would replicate the historic Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese Navy had decimated the Russians 40 years earlier. Now, with the American Armada approaching the Mariana Islands, the time for that ultimate catastrophic engagement had come. The strategy was titled Operation Ago. It represented Japan's final desperate gamble. At its center was the first mobile fleet, the last significant gathering of Japanese maritime strength, a grand collection of carriers, battleships, and cruisers sailing to confront the foe. Heading this maneuver was Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a sharp but realistic leader who recognized the slim chances of success. His armada was imposing, but it was a crippled titan. His aviators, once the undisputed rulers of the air, were now mostly quickly trained novices, missing the expertise and talent of their deceased predecessors. His fuel stocks were vanishing, and his data regarding the enemy's coordinates was perilously sparse. Nonetheless, at the very heart of his group, Ozawa held a trump card, a symbol of technical dominance and a flicker of optimism for a nation on the edge. She was a brand new 30,000-ton supercarrier, a floating steel bastion engineered to be absolutely unbeatable. Her name was Taihō, the Great Phoenix. As the lead ship of this final Grand Fleet, Taihō was more than a mere combatant, and she was the tangible representation of Kantai Kessen. She stood for the peak of all Japanese technical skill, a weapon built to endure the harshest enemy attacks and strike the final blow. Upon her armored surfaces, the destiny of the entire mission, and perhaps the conflict itself, hung. The strategy was daring. It utilized the greater range of their planes to attack American carriers from a distance, refuel in Guam, and then attack once more, destroying the U.S. Navy's primary strength before their B-29 craft could ever endanger Tokyo. It was a sophisticated, graceful plan, yet one that permitted no mistakes. Every detail had to be flawless. But combat is never perfect. It is a theater of disorder, luck, and unintended results. As the Great Phoenix traveled toward her fate in the Philippine Sea, a quiet hidden stalker was already following her from the abyss. The spectacular naval duel that the Japanese command had envisioned for generations was destined to be eclipsed by a much more personal and treacherous style of war. How could a craft built to survive an apocalypse of aerial bombs be so completely vulnerable to a single hidden danger from below? To comprehend the Great Phoenix, one must first grasp the blaze that created it. The year is 1942. At the Battle of Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy, then the sovereign ruler of the Pacific endured a strike so ruinous it would forever change the war's path. In the span of a few horrific hours, 4 of its best fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were turned into flaming pyres. These were not merely boats, and they were the core of the Kido Butai, the elite force that had crippled America at Pearl Harbor. Their destruction was more than a strategic loss, it was a psychological trauma that revealed a deadly flaw in Japan's whole strategy for naval combat. Prior to Midway, Japanese carrier engineering was a stunning display of offensive power. Their vessels were designed for velocity, distance, and housing the largest possible air wing. They were the sleek racing dogs of the sea, able to project influence further and quicker than any competitors. But this emphasis on striking came at a heavy cost, and they were remarkably fragile. Their hangar areas were vast open caverns, and their flight decks were basically wooden planks placed over an unshielded frame, and they were, in essence, eggshells carrying mallets. A single precise American bomb could penetrate the deck, ignite the armed and fueled planes underneath, and trigger a chain of uncontrollable fires and secondary blasts. Midway demonstrated this reality with terrifying certainty. From the wreckage of that catastrophe, a new necessity emerged. The leaders in Tokyo, once so sure of their blueprints, were forced to face a frightening new truth: their carriers could not outlast a focused aerial strike. The next class of warships could not just be quick, they had to be resilient. They needed to be anvils, not just mallets, capable of taking extreme damage and staying in the fight. This drastic change in philosophy resulted in the Taihō. Manufacturing had started in July 1941 at the Kawasaki yards in Kobe, but the war's lessons now defined her final shape. She would be a pioneering step forward, a total break from her weak forebears. Her most unique trait, and the one that gave the Navy great assurance, was her armored flight deck. Unlike any Japanese carrier before her, Taihō's surface was a built-in part of the vessel's frame, a massive slab of 75 mm plating set over 20 mm of steel. This unparalleled shield was meant to deflect a direct strike from a 500 kg or 1,000 pounds bomb, the very tool that had ruined the ships at Midway. For the first time, a Japanese carrier's flight deck was not a weakness but its main defensive layer. This progress was paired with another innovation: her hangar levels were entirely enclosed inside the armored hull, shielding the sensitive core of the boat from shrapnel and pressure waves. The modern engineering continued, and her island structure was integrated smoothly into the hull, and her smokestack was tilted away to prevent fumes and heat from disrupting flight tasks, elements that would become standard on carriers for decades. Driven by engines producing over 160,000 horsepower, she could cut through water at a rapid 33 knots, fast enough to escape any danger and place her air group for an ideal strike. She was a masterpiece of late-conflict naval design, a proof of Japan's capacity to create under extreme stress. When she was finished in March 1944 and named Admiral Izoa's flagship, she was viewed as the ultimate remedy for American air strength, the vessel that could not be destroyed. But creating a stronghold to stop an external foe produces its own specific set of difficulties. In locking the ships so tightly against strikes, had her engineers accidentally made a new, more treacherous threat already trapped inside with the sailors? For all her outer toughness, the Taihō was a vessel of deep contradictions. She was a fort built to keep death away, yet she held a lethal flaw hidden deep within her own frame. This was not a mistake visible on a plan, nor was it the outcome of one technical slip. it was a complex and sad mixture of strategic desperation, industrial decline, and the unproven status of her own modern systems. A dormant bomb was placed in the Great Phoenix before she ever launched, and its clock was set by the fading luck of the Japanese Empire itself. The core of the difficulty, oddly, was the ship's own vitality, her fuel. By 1944, the quiet lethal operations of the U.S. Navy's submarine fleet had successfully cut Japan's supply lines. The abundant oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, once the primary goal of Japan's expansion, were now mostly blocked. The vital high-quality oil required for flight fuel was down to a minimum. What did reach Japan was often unrefined Tarakan crude, a low-tier fuel famous for having volatile, unstable parts. When kept, this fuel had a scary tendency to release highly explosive gas. It was less a stable liquid and more a trapped explosion waiting for a trigger. The vessel's designers knew of this risk, a shared issue across the late war Navy, so they did what skilled engineers do, they made a fix. But was the remedy they created far more lethal than the problem? The fix was an advanced ship-wide mechanical airing system, a complex web of pipes and blowers built to constantly pull air from the fuel tanks and other vital areas and blow the risky fumes safely out to sea. Theoretically, it was a totally sound and active safety step. In reality, it was a disastrous error. Unlike American carriers, which utilized several smaller separate airing units, the Taihō's was unified. A single massive web of pipes linked nearly every major area below decks like veins leading to one heart, creating a terrible single point of failure. If any part of this web was damaged, the system meant to remove the toxin would instead become its carrier, blowing an unseen highly reactive gas to every part of the vessel. How could a system built for protection become the very tool of the ship's ruin? This technical weak point was worsened by an equally risky human element. The sailors who took the Taihō into war were not the elite battle-tested group that had crushed the U.S. Pacific Navy in 1941. Most of those experts now rested in ocean graves from Midway to the Solomons. Taihō's crew of about 1,700 men were mostly new recruits, well-trained and deeply dedicated but lacking the vital instinct that only comes from combat. They were given the most complex vessel in the Navy, a ship whose intricate parts were still mostly unproven in the turmoil of war. Worse, they were told their vessel was unbeatable, a claim that created a quiet but wide overconfidence. They were coached to stop fires they could see and fix holes they could find. Who could possibly teach them to stop an enemy that was scentless, clear, and quietly filling the very air they inhaled? As Admiral Ozawa's armada sailed boldly toward its meeting with fate, it was moving right over a quiet hidden surveillance line. Across the Philippine Sea was a web of American subs, a pack of steel hunters given a single goal: find the Japanese Navy and deliver the first hit. Deep under the waves in the tight diesel-smelling rooms of the USS Albacore, Commander James Blanchard and his team were scouting. Life on a sub was a weird blend of intense dullness and heart-stopping dread, long periods of silent travel broken by moments of total life-or-death drama. On the morning of June 19, 1944, their chance came. At roughly 7:40 a.m., a signal, the sonar man noted the light steady beat of far-off engines, many of them. Blanchard told the sub to go to periscope level, and as the thin tube broke the water, the sight in its lens was what every submariner hopes for. It wasn't just one boat, it was the whole first mobile fleet, and right in its center was a prize of incredible worth, a giant modern carrier bigger than any they had seen, with a smooth tidy shape that showed it was new. It was the Taihō, moving with the proud assurance of a ruler among her escort ships. Blanchard realized at once that sinking this one vessel could ruin the whole Japanese mission before it truly started. The team on the Albacore went to work, a burst of focused energy in the tight room. They had the target of a lifetime in view, but just as they prepared to put the data into their high-tech torpedo computer, the machine brain that found the best firing path, trouble occurred, and the computer broke. The complex assembly of parts that could calculate the target's path with great precision was dead. For many leaders this would be a failure, but Blanchard was an old hand. He would do it the traditional way, a manual aim using gut feeling, skill, and a marker on the periscope. It was a test of pure courage and talent, a lethal math puzzle that had to be done in minutes with zero margin for error. At 9:09 a.m., with the Taihō filling his view, Blanchard gave the command to fire. Successively, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes left their tubes, pushed by compressed air, their own motors starting as they sped toward the flagship. On the bridge of the Taihō, a scout yelled a warning, "A torpedo trails on the right." On the flight deck, a scene of busy work, planes being readied for the first attack, turned into ordered panic. The giant carrier started a sharp turn, its frame creaking under the load. For a second it looked like her pace and turn would save her, and one torpedo missed, then another, 2 more went harmlessly behind, a 5th was avoided by inches, a wave of relief felt by the Japanese sailors. But then came the 6th torpedo. It wasn't a perfect hit, maybe off due to the manual aim, but it was enough. It hit the carrier's right side just ahead of the island near the flight fuel tanks. The strike was not the giant fireball one might expect, it was a heavy deep bang that vibrated through the 30,000-ton boat, knocking men down. The ship tilted a bit as water entered 2 rooms, and the blast bent the flight deck enough to stick the front plane lift. Yet the motors were fine, and the vessel was still moving fast and could even go on, though slowly, with flight duties. The mood on board was not terror but pride. They had hit a torpedo and lived, the armored plan had worked. The Great Phoenix was truly unbeatable. They were sadly, fatally mistaken. The torpedo had done much more than just make a hole. Its shock had broken pipes and the fuel tank itself, starting a slow, nearly unseen drip of high-power gas. They had survived the hunter's strike, but in doing so they had just released a far more patient and lethal killer inside their own hull. How could the very act meant to save the ship now be the one that ensured its doom? On the bridge of the Taihō, the first panic of the hit quickly turned into a feeling of calm, defiant hope. The ship was tilting but only a little, her pace was down but she stayed moving. The front lift was stuck, a big problem, but the back lift still worked. Admiral Ozawa, seeing his team's fast work, was pleased. His flagship had taken a direct strike from a US sub and was still fighting. The news from below seemed to back this up. The water was stopped and the damage, while real, was seen as fixable. For the next 6 hours, the sailors of the Taihō lived with the deadly belief that the worst was over. Truly, the clock on their ruin had just started. Deep in the ship's broken front, the real peril was growing not with a loud blast but with the quiet of a moving mist. The broken fuel tank was steadily leaking its volatile fluid into the front rooms and the lift shaft. The crude poor fuel turned into a thick unseen gas, heavier than air. This deadly fog pulled in the lowest floors, a ghostly scentless pool of pure explosive power. The men working nearby to fix walls and stop water had no clue they were moving through air that was getting more dangerous every minute. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, smell, or hear? It was in this setting of false safety that one final choice was made. A young keen officer whose name is now forgotten checked the area, and he rightly saw the leaking fuel as a fire risk. His coaching said such gas needed to be removed, and facing a task not in any book, he made what seemed a smart choice. He told the ship's big airing system to run at max power, aiming to pull the gas out of the broken rooms and blow it away. It was a choice based on goodwill but a total lack of knowledge about his ship's layout. What he thought was a help was really a lit fuse. The moment the fans started, the ship's end was set. The system built for safety became a carrier of death. Instead of clearing the gas, the strong pull started sucking the thick vapor from the broken tank into the main air pipes, and from there it was spread perfectly to nearly every spot in the ship. The very air in the closed hangars, the dining areas, the halls, and the engine rooms was slowly swapped with a perfect fuel-air mix. For 6 long hours, the men of the Taihō did their jobs unaware that their whole world had become a bomb. They ate lunch, fixed wires, and used metal tools, any of which could have made the spark. They were existing, breathing, and working inside a giant floating explosive, and they had said it themselves. As the day went on, the risk grew higher. The day's heat and the ship's motors would have made the gas expand, pushing it into every small crack. Every light switch, every motor spark, every door scrape was a risk. The Great Phoenix, the unbeatable fort, was now likely the riskiest spot on the planet. With thousands of men doing thousands of jobs, a spark was no longer a maybe but a when. The end hit without notice. At 2:32 p.m., about 6.5 hours after the torpedo, the unseen foe that had filled the Taihō finally found its spark. The exact cause is lost, maybe a wire arc, a drop tool, or just static in the gas-rich air. The first blast wasn't the ship-breaking event one might think, it was a dull heavy thump, a sudden pressure deep in the closed hangar. For a brief moment, the men on deck might have looked at each other confused, and they wouldn't be for long. That first pop was just the pilot flame. What followed was a chain of pure fire. The first wave, moving at the speed of sound, went through the air pipes, lighting the gas in every linked room at once. A second later, the main hangar, now a 600-foot fuel bomb, burst. The power was so big it had to go up, in the great armored deck. The 75mm shield that was the ship's purpose, became the cap on a gas bottle. It was blown off its base, bending and tearing up with a metal scream. Huge bits of 3-inch steel were thrown high into the sky, spinning before falling back. The Taihō was being split not by an outside foe but by her own fire. The fort had become a volcano. A tall pillar of black and orange fire shot from the middle, followed by debris and bodies. The blast killed hundreds fast, and below it was worse. More blasts started tearing the ship's inside as the fire hit the bombs and planes. Torpedoes and 500-pound bombs went off, each pop making another hole, breaking walls, and turning rooms into graves. The ship built to take 10 bombs from above was now being gutted by 10 bomb-sized blasts from within. On the bridge, Ozawa and his team were thrown as their world broke. He saw in shock as his flagship, his sign of hope, was eaten by a fire that couldn't be stopped. The ship's frame was gone, fires grew, fed by air entering the hull wounds. The ship tilted hard to the left, the angle growing fast as more rooms flooded. The call to leave was just a formality, the vessel was dying. Ozawa's team had to pull him away, begging him to move his flag to the cruiser Haguro. Leaving his dying ship was the hardest task he ever did. As his boat left, he saw the final agony. The Phoenix was a wreck in smoke and fire, her shape broken. At 4:28 p.m., less than 2 hours after the first spark, the final blast came. A big pop deep down meant the end. Taihō's back snapped, and she rolled over, paused as if in salute, and then sank backfirst into the Philippine Sea. She took about 1,650 men with her, nearly everyone. The sea, once a stage for a Titan, was empty except for oil and survivors. How could a nation's best hope end so fast and violently by its own hand? The smoke at Taihō's grave was a pyre for more than a ship, it signaled the end of Japan's naval attack power. As before, the carrier Shokaku had also been sunk by a U.S. sub, the Cavalla. This double blow broke Ozawa's command and left his pilots with no place to land. When the young flyers came back, their homes were gone, forcing sea landings or tries on other ships, adding to the loss the U.S. called the Great Turkey Shoot. The big battle Japan bet on was over before it started. But Taihō's real legacy isn't in the battle stats. Her story is a sad summary of Japan's defeat. Her loss wasn't from lack of heart or skill or enemy power, it was a system failure. Death by many cuts started long ago. Japan could dream of a great ship, but its failing factories could only give the bad fuel that made it a bomb. They could build her, but the long war meant only new men could sail her, leading to the fatal error. The Taihō was built for the last war, an answer to Midway. She was made to take hits from outside but was killed by a single blow that let out poison from within. Her death was not a grand fight but a slow collapse from hidden flaws. She wasn't just sunk by a torpedo, she was a victim of a broken promise and the reality of a losing war. In the end, we ask, is the biggest threat the enemy at the gate or the flaw we build into our own foundations?